Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm speaking with sports coaching lecturer James Barraclough. James, welcome.
Hi there, Dan, and thanks for having me on.
Well, I'm looking forward to unpacking a paper you've recently done on psychological skills and characteristics. So we're going to be talking about that within academy football, academy soccer. But tell us a little bit about yourself first.
Okay, so my background, initially did a degree in psychology at Goldsmiths University. I believe you're a fellow.
Yeah, wow, okay.
Yeah,
That's a rare. I never really bump into anybody who's now in sport who's been to Goldsmiths.
yeah. But part of that, I guess, was that I didn't really, if I'm being totally honest, enjoy the degree as such. But there was a sports psych module on the degree
Was there?
at the time, which was kind of mid-90s. I'm showing my age here, but that was the one bit that kind of piqued my interest, and sort of later came back to that. So yeah, I was later went on to do a master's in sports psychology at Manchester Met, during which time we were encouraged to go off and do some coaching badges as well. So I took my level 2 FA coaching badge, and also sort of that ignited a bit of a spark for coaching as well. So in the sort of next sort of 20 years or so after that, I've worked on coaching and trying to combine psych into coaching as well. Following the Masters, I spent 9 months coaching in the States, which was a really good experience, and various coaching sort of tasks with grassroots, after-school clubs, kind of putting in the hours with the more sort of basic stuff, I guess you could call it. Coached at Manchester University for a couple of seasons, was a performance psychologist with them in the late noughties, which was, I think, probably the most successful period. Managed to win 12 titles in 2 years between the 4 teams. So that was
Wow.
hopefully evidence that it was successful. Yeah, and then various other things. Went into teaching around 2009. Coaching and psych alone weren't really paying the bills, if I'm being honest. So I needed a bit of a steady income to work alongside that. Also developed a passion for teaching as well, and passing on knowledge, and kind of gone into HE lecturing in sports coaching and sports science. So I've kind of got 3 strands, I guess you could say: teaching, the coaching side, and I'm one of those horrible people who call themselves a performance psych rather than a sports psych. So I have that strand, although I appreciate there's I mean, we could probably talk an entire podcast around the issues between performance psych and sports psych, but I have some experience there. The last 10 years, experience in coaching has been in academy football, so various Cat 3 academies around the Northwest. Spent a year at Stockport County when they were still Centre of Excellence, the year before the EPPP came in. 4 really good years at Wigan. Fantastic setup there, which I think can be, you can see by all the players that have gone on to play. Their sort of conversion rate, if you like, is phenomenal. 2.5 fantastic years at Bury following that, which is probably the favourite part of my coaching journey so far. Unfortunately, we know the demise of the club. And then a couple of 2.5 years or so at Oldham Athletic. And during kind of the latter years in that, I've kind of become a little bit disillusioned with some of the talent ID, talent development processes and retain and release, particularly around psychosocial factors. So that inspired me to do a doctorate, a professional doctorate, which is where obviously the research in today's paper came from. And that's kind of brought us up to date, hopefully.
Wow, what a journey. James, did you play football, soccer, growing up? How did you become a football coach?
By accident, I guess. I was an enthusiastic amateur. I'll never kind of profess to being particularly good at football.
Okay.
But I think one of the sparks for getting into psych was during a game. I remember it vividly, where we were 2-0 up at half time. We were cruising against the team, and we ended up losing 5-2. And it was just one guy on the other team. I think he scored 4 and had an assist, and played like he was in a trance. I think we refer to that as a flow state. But yeah, it was just kind of that lit a real fire for me. I was thinking, nothing's really changed technically or physically. Maybe some tactical adjustments, but there's something must be something else in this guy that's fueled that performance in that second half, which kind of made me look at psych, and I've been fascinated with it ever since. And like I say, I almost fell into coaching really. We were recommended to do a badge as part of the Masters programme at MMU. So I tagged onto the level 2 football coaching and didn't really think much of it, and absolutely loved it. So I've been working my way up. I've got my level 3. Tried unsuccessfully to get on the A licence for a few years. So then decided to do the level 4 Advanced Youth Award, which is, I can say, is one of the best courses I've ever done. It's a fantastic course, and it looks at the player holistically in a lot of detail. So I'd recommend that to anyone who's thinking of it.
Going back to your game where you were 2-0 up, I mean, it's always interesting where that love, interest for, passion for, I suppose, any profession that one does, where it comes from, where it stems from, and for it to come from one experience in one game or just one game, it's really, really interesting. And just dwelling on that game, you said you were 2-0 up. It's very relevant for me at the moment. I'm writing a lot around, there's a lot of controversy as to how the brain actually works and what it's doing. But if you think about the brain in a competitive environment and its moments of uncertainty, but the volume of certainty goes up when you're 2-0 up at half time, and it becomes a reward rather than a threat. And it's so easy for teams then to become a little bit more lackadaisical, not quite as intense, not quite playing with as much intent, if you like, maybe drifting a little bit with focus of attention because, hey, we're 2-0 up. And then suddenly it goes 2-1, and then the threat volume rises up. And it's that kind of, I mean, you've spoken about an opposing striker being in a flow state, and that was what did damage. But it always interests me how teams can let oppositions in when they're winning as a consequence of being rewarded and then threatened, and that mindset being slightly all over the place. And that's always fueled my desire to give sports competitors, professional footballers, these kind of mental frameworks. Because if we don't have these mental frameworks, if we don't have these mental skills, it's challenging to deal with these specific things that are thrown at us during a game. No question, James.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's that's a bit of a cliche in football that 2-0 is a dangerous score.
Yeah, I was thinking.
Yeah,
that.
it just it really inspired me the way this lad played, and then he lifted the whole team as well around him. It was almost like we were hopeless. It was like watching Man City play an under-9s team, and we just couldn't get near the ball, couldn't get near this guy. It was just that was the trigger for me that kind of got me into psych, really.
Yeah, interesting. And so we're here today to talk about a paper that you've just written. And as you mentioned earlier, you have a real passion for psychosocial skills within talent development pathways. And the paper you've written here alongside David Grecic, who I know well from my time at England Golf, and Damian Harper, is entitled English Premier League and English Football League Academy Managers' Experiences of How Psychosocial Skills and Characteristics Are Identified and Developed in youth academy soccer players. Give us you've given us a sort of a brief history as to your interest in this area, but give us a broader history as to how you came to this specific topic with David and with Damian.
I think it's more my experience as a coach. I've worked sort of exclusively in the YDP and youth development phase, so 13 to 16-year-olds and under 12s as well. So that kind of overlaps between foundation and youth development in Cap 3 clubs, and just kind of disillusionment really with the way that players were released and the sort of the volume of players and players where in my opinion, they've had psychosocial maybe deficits, if you like, that could have been developed. But because we have this obsession in football with technical and physical metrics, it maybe wasn't spotted. So little things like players losing focus, that possibly a little bit of goal setting might have helped them with, or self-talk or other interventions, but it wasn't spotted. It was just seen as maybe they're technically deficient. Things like that kind of disillusioned me a little bit. And without wanting to sound self-righteous, because I've actually been part of that process, so I think I'm probably as guilty as anyone else. So probably as much from a guilty conscience as anything else, really, that I kind of wanted to make a difference and, maybe develop that, what I call the missing corner, the psychosocial corner.
Just dwelling a second on what you said there, you were as guilty as everybody else. So if I had flown in to watch you coach at a time when you don't think you were doing the right things or offering the right guidance, what would I have seen or what would I have not seen?
I think there's a lot of cognitive bias that exists. So I think I've probably been guilty of sort of confirmation bias. I think earlier on in my, particularly in academy football, you kind of want to fit in a little bit and you don't want to rock the boat. And there's, pressure to conform to certain things that I think the worst saying in any organisation is this is the way we've always done it. But I think if you're in that and there's a lot of, typically kind of male ego driven behavior, with the best will in the world, I think you do want to fit in with that. So I think I've possibly been a little bit guilty of that in the past, but something I kind of pride myself on sort of being a bit different now, I think, if possible.
In this study, you were studying psychological skills and characteristics. Can you tell us a little bit more about psychological skills and characteristics, and who specifically were you speaking with about psychological skills and characteristics?
Yeah, so to maybe give this a little bit more context, this is a second paper from my professional doctorate. The first one was looking at differences between different category players and different age players, looking at which sort of characteristics might differentiate them between being a Cat 1 player or going on to a youth team player and possibly having a greater chance of being a professional. There was 4 things that stuck out from that. Perfectionist tendencies tend to be a thing, so they tend to be more perfectionists. They tend to respond in a worse way to failure, to losing. They tend to do more. So there's the phrase that winners do more. So they'll do more stuff outside of actual academy hours, what we call self-directed control and management. So they'll do more outside of the actual prescribed academy hours. And they also tend to be better at coping and maybe have a better support social network around them. So this led into the second paper where we thought we'd go and actually ask the academy managers their thoughts. We do see a lot of academy bashing in the media. Tends to be a lot of disgruntled parents, often with good reason. Sometimes not so much. So we thought it'd be really interesting to actually ask academy managers what they thought and to identify some of the challenges and issues that exist rather than kind of looking at it from purely an external perspective. So surprise, surprise, they did kind of agree that psychological skills and characteristics were the key drivers of success, but probably the least developed. And we had a number of ideal outcomes that they've identified. So self-evaluation, so players being able to honestly look at what they've done. So we don't want them to be too harsh on themselves, particularly if they are perfectionists, perhaps. But also we do want them to realise what maybe their weaknesses are. So I know weaknesses is a bit of a rude word in psychology, but I think acknowledging that allows us then to develop that into a strength, perhaps. Resilience, I know it's a bit of a buzzword, but it's there for a reason. It's important that players have that sort of robust and rebound resilience so they can cope with things sort of in play and deal with them afterwards through reflection. Work ethic, again, it's a bit of a who knew one, so like players that work hard. From my experience, even in academy football, you do get some players that coast and kind of can be a little bit entitled at times. Interpersonal skills, so being able to communicate with teammates, other significant others, key stakeholders, coaches, parents, phase leads, academy managers, and so on. Autonomy was a really big one that came out as well from particularly sort of Cat 1 level and older players. So being able to own their journey a little bit so they don't constantly need to be told, you need to go and practice this, they'll go and do it extras on their own. So that links in with the finding from study 1 about self-directed control and management. And then the social support side of it as well. So these were the key kind of psychological skills and characteristics that came out from academy managers.
Okay, that's really interesting. So, what you're saying to me is you've interviewed these academy managers, and just to break this down and bring this alive for people listening in, you've mentioned category one, category three, and four. This is the categories in English football, English soccer are as a consequence of the EPPP. Can we just back up a second here? I think it's important to help those people listening in who aren't involved in football or soccer. There's plenty of those listening in. Can you give us a bit of history as the EPPP, these categories, before we unpack this research paper further?
Yeah, apologies there. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So, 2012, the Elite Player Performance Plan was introduced by the Premier League. The idea being that we could improve not just kind of club football, but international football, which I think we've seen is being quite successful over the last few tournaments. And accordingly, academies were divided into categories from 1 to 4. So, category 1 being the most elite. They have the most contact time and the biggest resources, so budgets, full-time staff, specialist staff. Category 2 would be then slightly less. Category 3 less again, and Category 4 would be professional phase only. So that's either maybe youth team only or youth team and under 23s.
And is it only in category one where there's a sort of a mandated sports psychologist? They have to have a sports psychologist or sports psychologists involved?
That's right, yeah. So currently it is only mandatory at category 1. I think a few things that emerge from this current study is there's a lot of good practice going on at categories 2 and 3 that maybe academy managers have taken on their own shoulders, either through external stuff or the practice that they do within the academies and around session design and the way they conduct games and things like that.
And in this paper, you're sitting down, you're speaking with academy managers, 9 specifically, some of whom are in category 1s, others who are in category 2 and 3, I believe. And the first part of this study is asking them to break down what they think are the most important psychosocial skills, the psychosocial skills and characteristics. And listen to what you said. I'm just going to reflect back what I think I heard you say. They want players who are able to self-evaluate. They want players who are exhibiting a sense of resilience. They want players with a work ethic. They want players with interpersonal skills. They want players who demonstrate a degree of autonomy. And they want players who are engaging in social support. Sounds like a fair list. Did I hear that correctly? Did I miss any out?
Yeah, I think that's the main gist of it. So yeah, it's quite extensive, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And hey, look, if you've got a wish list in terms of how you'd want your players, your people to develop, what skills you'd want them to develop from a psychosocial perspective, they're pretty fair, right?
Yeah, they do link with a lot of existing theory as well. So you can just one off the top of my head, self determination theory could slot into there quite easily. But again, we have to remember these are opinions of academy managers who've obviously been in the job between them for an enormous amount of time. Looking ahead to paper 3, we've actually added a little bit more to that from existing theory as well. Currently collaborating with Tom Mitchell from Leeds Beckett on that, who alongside you, Clan, are doing a lot of fantastic research into academy football.
And Tom has been on the show to discuss this very area. I mean, just very briefly, and we're not going to dwell on paper 3. And I know you're in the process of completing it, but what do you add to the list from a psychosocial perspective?
So it's kind of developing some of the work that Tom's already done around his 8 Pillars program, which
Yes.
in itself is a development of the 5 C's. So Harwood and Anderson. So we're looking at control, confidence, commitment, communication, concentration. Tom's added resilience, self-awareness, and presence. And then we filtered in a few more from this current study. And we're looking at making it more bespoke and individual testing for each player rather than more of a blanket approach, which the 5 C's was a little bit more program centered where everyone gets the same. We're looking to tailor it to individual players a little bit more.
And Professor Chris Harwood has been on the show to discuss his work, his 5 Cs, and work on achievement goal theory, which I thoroughly recommend listening to. Coming back to this study, so the first interview set was with these academy managers, essentially breaking down from their experience what they feel, what psychosocial skills and characteristics they feel are important. Where did we go there?
So there was two storybook themes really from the research. So the first one was around sort of current ideas, and the second was more around challenges and issues. So the second part of the first storybook theme was looking at current practice. So a bit of a mixed bag with this one. Some were doing some excellent work, whether it was Cat 1, 2 or 3, seemed irrelevant to the work they were doing. Some of them also kind of were doing it a little bit more by feel rather than formal. So a lot of good work going on, but it wasn't really written down. It was stuff that they were doing kind of off the cuff a little bit more. So kind of hard to measure and hard to develop, perhaps, if you're not getting a baseline and something to measure it against later. And then, as I say, we looked at kind of the second part, which was more around challenges, which I think was interesting to see some of the issues that academy managers do face, particularly around dealing with sort of transitions in football and the things that are going on outside of footballers or young footballers' life. Issues with maybe staffing and recruitment. Time and money was one that came up again and again, regardless of category. Never seemed to be enough time, particularly working with lots of staff, perhaps. And then suggestions for maybe getting help from external places, such as maybe university departments or private organisations or charities that deal with kind of mental health support and things like that.
This sounds really interesting. So let's back up and let's break this down. So you've broken down some of the feedback here around their experiences of PSCs and the challenges that affect the development of psychosocial skills and characteristics into storybook themes. I love that idea of storybook themes. And storybook theme 1 is how psychosocial skills and characteristics are identified and developed in youth academy soccer players. Can you you sort of gave us an overview. Could you unpack that for us in more granular detail? How those characteristics and skills are identified and developed. What were these academy managers saying to this? Their current practices, how they go about this.
Yeah, it was a bit of a mixed bag. Like I say, it varied across. There were certain themes across academies and certain differences. One category 2 academy in particular was working with a qualified sports psych who'd started his own business and was coming in and doing some really in-depth mixed methods assessment with the players. So questionnaires, interviews, data from coach observations. So they were really nailing it, and like I say, using external partners to be able to do that. Others kind of were aware that some psyche stuff was going on, but weren't really sure, didn't really engage with the psychs, and were a little bit maybe cynical of questionnaires and things like that. So kind of kept them at arm's length, perhaps, and let them get on with it. And others around maybe more around session design and getting players to completely own the sessions and even go into games without coaches. So that's pretty revolutionary, I think, in academy football. As that for me, that's just being really open-minded and willing to take risks and looking at the bigger picture rather than just results. And I've actually seen some sort of video clips of that academy and the players, the information they're giving each other and the standard of the kind of the tactical feedback is phenomenal. So yeah, more stuff like that I think would be really useful. But it's a bit of a mixed bag at the minute.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at some of the data, coming back to some of the qualitative data here, one academy manager saying in the past it's just been done off eye and it's a subjective opinion. Whereas now the work that we're doing with our external company will give us that objective opinion. So that's the academy manager that you spoke about at the club who have an external company. Another one said there's questionnaires and all sorts of things that you could try to test these things. When you're looking at players, the difficulty is applying that when you're watching under 12 sessions or under 12 games. What does that look like on the grass? So there feels to me a tension between, measurement off the pitch, application on the pitch, the disparity between the two. Do we bother to measure it? Are questionnaires a valid tool in using this? Can we just do this on the pitch through our session design, our coach behavior? You're an experienced coach. I mean, I'd love, and you're a performance psychologist. What's your position on all of this?
I think this is a massive debate, isn't it, really? So we talk about the dichotomy between practice and academia. It's almost like they're polar opposites. So for me, it's more of a continuum. So there should be somewhere that you could meet in the middle. I don't think I'm unique in being an academy coach and having a psych background, but I think it's quite rare. So I think I can see both sides of the argument, really. So if I was to spend time talking to a coach for a few hours, I'd probably slide more towards that side of the continuum. If I spoke to an academic for a few hours, possibly the other way. So the challenge really is, for me, seeing what's valid in terms of how we measure players. Again, hopefully our paper 3 will address that to an extent. And then the big point is how we get that on the grass. So to use one of your phrases, Dan, psych is always present. So the people that spend the most time with the players are the coaches. So surely the coaches should be kind of upskilled into what that looks like, rather than subjective and being more prone to cognitive bias. So I was really interested on your podcast recently with around your work with Arne Slot at Feyenoord. So I think being open-minded is probably the most important thing, whether you're academic or practitioner. And you mentioned about having like a red, amber, green kind of scale. So the green scale, where it's the performance side, I think that's the area where practice in academia can really meet. When it gets towards the red side and it's more clinical issues, then that's very much specialist. But for me, I think that there's certainly a lot of more collaboration that can go on. And the two sides to that, I think that coaches need to buy into it better. I struggled with that on my recent study, but also I think psych needs to do better. Recent post, was it a post or an article you put on LinkedIn about psych maybe has let clients down at times, maybe too much jargon and too much academia. So I think both sides could do better. It's how we sort of conquer that really and meet in the middle of that continuum.
Yeah, I don't want to go too much off topic here, but and probably what I'm about to say is very much on topic, and I'd like to have a mini conversation with you about it, because you're in such a strong position, James, having been, you're a football coach, soccer coach, so you're coaching, and you've coached at great clubs. You have this great psychology background, and you're a sports coach lecturer, so you've got a lot of strings to your bow in this environment. And for me, I wonder sometimes, James, and I'd love to get your opinion on this, if we just fail to help academy managers and others, key decision makers in clubs, we fail to help them understand what we can do and what we can offer, what this actual landscape looks like. And you mentioned my podcast episode where I spoke to John Nasori about my experiences as a sports psychologist and a little bit on Feyenoord there. And, I spoke to John about, for me, the importance of actually defining what we do and how we can do it. And, going back to that red, amber, green light, for me, the green is the performance psychology. I'm defining sports psychology in 3 ways, and I know people will see it differently, but for me, it's the performance psychology piece, which is the green light, which we're all in on. As you said, whether it's Chris Harwood's 5 C's, Tom's Mitchell's extension of that, stuff coming out of your work here, Anya McNamara and Dave Collins's PCDEs, whatever model we're using, I think that's the green light. We're all in on performance psychology. The amber piece piece is the well-being and the welfare piece, where there's probably going to have to be a conversation between player or players and a psych who has an expertise in the kind of psychological frameworks that can help support players, people, in what they want to be supported with, and whether that's shared with the broader environment, the coaching staff, the academy manager, etc. This is an amber, not necessarily, but perhaps. And then the red piece is the mental health piece, which is the area that maybe a clinical psychologist is going to be involved in, deeper psychopathological challenges, and so on and so forth. So I just think that when we go into these environments, we're not helping these clubs, these environments, these organizations, these talent development pathways actually define psychology, define sports psychology well enough, thoroughly enough, in enough granular detail so that we really know what we're doing here. What are we doing here? How are we doing this? And this, as you can tell from my voice, it really winds me up, because then it becomes just a plethora of anything goes. Whereas if we can get the definitions right, if we can 100% know what we're doing, then we've got a better chance to actually organize something that is fruitful for everybody. No question, James, just a rant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to put our own house in order, really. Another shameless plug. I'm currently writing a narrative review around this. And one of the factors is that, there's so many different PSCs out there, psychosocial factors and characteristics. We can't even define that properly. There's about 3 or 4 or more different definitions of what it is. Then how can we try and measure it? And particularly, there's a couple of really good papers by Lee Kachindoma from Leeds Beckett around this a few years ago, including a systematic review. To that extent, and it's all really confusing. And we're expecting sports psychs to come in, maybe straight from university, and be able to apply these skills straight away. And that's a criticism maybe as well of university education, that you might be able to talk about self-determination theory or achievement goal theory, but can you communicate with a coach? Can you understand some of the technical, tactical elements that are going on in the pitch in front of you? So I think there's definitely a case for kind of getting students out there and being involved with the process at an earlier stage and in a more kind of valid environment, if you like. So I think some degrees do that very well, and some need to do that a lot better. But yeah, I agree with you there, Dan. I think we need to put our own house in order a little bit first.
Just dwelling on the storybook 1 theme. I mean, obviously, coaches, academy managers speaking to the use of questionnaires, and you said there, being on both sides of the continuum. You can talk to an academic, sports psychology academic, who's perhaps created some of these inventories, these questionnaires, and you can thoroughly agree with their point of view. You can speak to coaches who might say, questionnaires, what's that about? We don't need that. We just need to get it right on the grass. And you can actually thoroughly speak to that. I think with questionnaires, I'd be keen to get your opinion, is that they can be useful for a certain point. They give you data points, right? They give you information. I think context matters. I think that, and I think it's really the ability to do something with those data points, to unpack it appropriately, individually specific enough, and with relation to the context is what matters. I think I've been in environments where coaches are immediately drawn towards, well, Dan, what kind of questionnaire can you bring into our organization? Because that's perceived as what a psychologist does. And you think, well, hang on a minute, let's just make sure that your environment, actually your context, needs that kind of thing. And then I've been in other environments where I thought, we could actually use this kind of questionnaire here. This might be useful within this context. And perhaps a coach hasn't been interested at all in that. I think context matters, and the capacity to unpack the data for individuals matters. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think we need to separate the signal from the noise, really, and it's validity again, isn't it, really? The last place we went into, someone had done a grit questionnaire.
Right.
Thought, yeah, that's great, but what are you using it for?
Yes.
So that's useful, but how does that translate onto the grass? How does it fit into a bigger picture? So I think questionnaires are useful if they, as you say, if they're valid and they're testing the right thing, particularly as maybe a baseline and at points throughout a season in football to see progress. But I do think they are part of a larger maybe mixed method. So we need to look at triangulating that data and looking at it from different angles. So what's the coach's opinion? Because they see them all the time. Bear in mind, they're going to have their own cognitive biases. There is one theory that suggests that you forget 50 to 60% of what you're actually observing anyway, for various reasons. We do have more objective measures. So most clubs have a VO camera or different types of camera and performance analysis, which the players can even do themselves. We have performance profiles we can use, and all different methods. So I think questionnaires are useful if they're valid, if they're not overdone, and if they're combined with other methods that give you a little bit more power to your data analysis.
I like that idea, separating the signal from the noise and really honing in on the signal. And I suppose my last question here, maybe it brings us to storybook theme 2, the challenges that affect the development of player psychosocial skills and characteristics, is, I suppose, in my practice, I think about there's an enormous amount of noise in any talent development pathway, any first team, but any talent development pathway, there's an enormous amount of noise. And I wonder sometimes when we draw this list of psychosocial skills and characteristics, which are all very, very important, but ultimately we can't fight every single fire. Do we have to break this down to the top 3 or 4, for example, that we know, okay, there's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 45, however many there are, as you said, that it's difficult to define how many there are, but do we break these down into 3 or 4 and get those right, except there's going to be some leakages, and get those 3 or 4 absolutely spot on with all of our players, again, accepting that there's going to be individual differences, but we get those right. These are our top 3 or 4 most important. These are the ones that perhaps correlate with players enjoying and benefiting from our talent development pathway from the youngest ages upwards. Do we focus on these and get these right? Just, again, a thought experiment there.
Yeah, so I mean, just sorry to add an extra bit to my last point. We have in football an absolute obsession with physical and technical metrics because they're easy to pin down. There's not that many components of fitness or techniques, and they're easy to measure quite objectively. With psych, you're measuring the abstract, so it's a lot more difficult, as you say, to apply that, whether it's questionnaires or whatever. So to answer your question, really, I think it is possible, even with a plethora of different psychosocial skills and characteristics, to narrow it down. So without kind of wanting to plug paper 3 again, that's what we've looked at. So we've looked at free performance profiling, identifying strengths and whether you want to call them weaknesses or areas for improvement, depends where your political correctness stands. But yeah, so we can then tailor it to individual players, and we can then design sessions around those players. So, for example, if a player is struggling with emotional control, we might put them in a situation where they're playing underloaded in a session, or play them out of position in a game, or we may do what I call the bad ref game, so we're giving decisions against them all the time, so that they are sort of losing the temper a little bit and getting a little bit emotional, but then you can step in and coach them. So I do think you can individualize it. So that's kind of where we're going next, is to try and make it more bespoke rather than that program centered where everyone gets the same delivery.
Storybook theme 2, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, challenges that affect the development of player psychosocial skills and characteristics. I mean, we're speaking to this anyway, but can you dig into this a little bit for us?
Yeah, so we've got kind of the challenges that exist through sort of player transitions. So not just what we call normative transitions, ones that you'd expect to happen, like moving up an age group or going from primary school to high school, things like that. Other things that might come in, such as injury, illness, bereavement, parental divorce, stuff like that. So how do we deal with that in a player? So you may have a player it looks like a world beater one week, and then he comes in and he looks like he's got 2 left feet. The next week, it may be something that's going on in his personal life, do we take enough note of that? There's also the physical changes. Are they going through a growth spurt? Hormonal stuff. So I think the best academies do account for that. It might not be universal across all. We also then need to look at, and the big thing, one of my big missions is kind of developing these skills in all players. So that will help with transitions. So the ones that they expect. So the tiny, whether you believe it's 1 to 5% have been the various estimates that are going to be professional players. So hopefully it will help them. But as I hinted at earlier, what about the massive amount, the 95% or so who don't make it? We've got a responsibility to help those players. And hopefully teaching them PSCs will help to do that. And it'll help them inside and outside football and to transition outside of football. So that's part of the major mission for me, really, is developing all players, not just the ones who make it. I'm not treating the others as collateral damage. And then we have the more sort of logistical ones, really, around recruitment. So anyone who's run a business knows that recruitment's very difficult, getting the right people in and keeping them in and training them up, etc. And then getting CPD with that as well within a busy schedule, particularly at sort of Cat 3. A lot of the staff will have full-time jobs as well. So you have to factor things like that in. We talk about mental health of players, but mental health of staff is also something that's important as well. We did get some data on that, but it didn't make it to the final cut. So I might be putting a few quotes about that onto LinkedIn at some point. And then time and money came up again and again, even at Cat 1s with multiple staff. So it's, there's never enough time in the week, really, for any academies.
Time, money, organisational constraints. Do you think most of this needs to be done if a club, a team, an organisation, a pathway has the luxury of having some kind of sports psychologist support? Does that sports psychologist need to work predominantly with and through coaching staff? So it's the coaching staff doing this in the classroom, on the grass. Do you think really that is the optimal way when it comes to dealing with organisational constraints?
I think it's thinking outside the box, because we've looked at Category 2 and Category 3 academy managers who've managed to sort of overcome that obstacle by a bit of sort of abstract thinking and the way they've designed session. I think psych should be involved in the classroom sessions. I think it needs to be evidence-based, which also coaches should buy into. Again, issues there if they've got full-time work and are struggling to attend. But I think coaches should do that, and I think coaches should be delivering the bulk on the grass and developing that skill moving forward into their career, but with support from some psychs on the side as well. So I think a lot more collaboration and a little less maybe silo working that we tend to see in clubs and everyone coming together, which is a dream. But when you factor in the human nature, it doesn't always come off as planned, does it really?
Do you think that we're asking too much of coaches when we consider that? Because I know in sports psychology we talk a lot about working with and through coaches, and the coaches are in, and I'm guilty of this, writing most days talking about, even now, I'm, from my recent experiences, saying players are the most powerful psychologists. They're not psychologists per se, I'm not saying that, but boy, if we can upskill players in order to better influence themselves, then that's very powerful. But we've spoken for many years now that coaches are in this wonderful position to deliver on these psychosocial skills, mental skills training, and so on and so forth. But you're a coach, you've been a coach for many years. Do you think that just adds to the pressure, the workload of the coach that feels almost unobtainable for many of them? Because that's how I feel. We've got to appreciate they've got so much to deliver on, understand. They've got to be flexible around their game model and their principles of play, and they've got to have a good grounding and understanding of the physical aspects of the game. Is it all a bit too much?
I think it all starts with coach education.
Okay.
I mentioned earlier that psych's the missing corner. So on the Advanced Youth Award, the psych and social corners were dealt with really well. It was they were given equal footing along with technical, tactical, physical. Bear in mind, someone who's not done any coaching badges for a few years. I think passed my B license around 2008. I can't really comment on current content, but to my knowledge, the psych is. I mean, when I did it, it was just like a couple of questions you have to answer, and it was really basic and really minimal. So I think if we get that right, then embedding psych into your sessions becomes a habit. And when I was looking at upskilling coaches for my sessions, I think we were looking at working 15 minutes with small groups or individuals on one session, and then the rest was around how they constrain the sessions or give conditions to individual players. So it was really minimal amount of work for coaches, but that has to come at the start. They need to be educated with that alongside our obsession with physical and technical parameters, I think.
As someone who's a huge fan of what the English Football Association has done over the last decade and longer, there's some wonderful people doing incredible work up there. I've always been a little bit critical of this idea of the four corner model. I understand it. And I've met the person who introduced it many, many years ago into the FA. I had a wonderful conversation, and he himself is a wonderful leader, coach, and coach educator. But it does concern me that coaches, if language drives behavior and language influences decision making, if we start talking in terms of corners, that slightly concerns me, and always has done, because we think about, well, am I covering this corner? Am I covering that corner? And to speak to something you mentioned earlier, a lot of my writing is on, well, psychology or psychosocial or biopsychosocial is always happening. It's, as Fergus Connolly said on here, on this podcast, it's omnipresent. It's constantly there. How can we divide things into corners when something is always present? Don't we want coaches to perceive human behavior as constantly influenced by biopsychosocial, mediated by biopsychosocial? Thus, there's no such thing as a corner. It's just always there.
Yeah, I mean, I like the four corner model for its simplicity. I think it's just easy to understand. But I've seen some of your work previously saying that everything is underpinned by psychosocial. So that's the base, that's the foundation, and then you build your house on top of that, if you like, with your technical, tactical, physical. Yeah, I think alluding to your previous question as well, I think coaches are already doing a lot of this, but they're doing it unconsciously or subconsciously.
Yep.
So I don't think it's that much of a stretch to get them to integrate this if they're already doing it. But it's noticing and maybe educating, as I mentioned, to actually realise what they're doing, and then we can look at sort of measurement and progression, as you would with the other kind of areas of performance.
Yeah, it's interesting. I do wonder sometimes if it's asking coaches to sit down with their session designs and think about it from a biopsychosocial or psychosocial perspective first, initially, as they start to broaden out their session plan with the themes that they want to introduce. Anyway, interesting stuff. James, absolutely fascinating conversation. I mean, where does this lead next? You've mentioned this paper 3, but what's next for you?
Yeah, so paper 3 was we're looking to publish that shortly, hopefully, and that's then on to me writing my thesis, which is going to be quite a lengthy task, I think. So that'll be my next sort of 6 months or so to 9 months spoken for, I guess, and then see where we go from there, really.
And to close out, putting you on the spot slightly, for all those listening in, give them 2 or 3 takeaway points from everything that we've been talking about today, from your research papers, the psychosocial skills and characteristics. Give us 2 or 3 takeaway points.
Yeah, so I guess to quote yourself, psych's always present. So we know from the research we've done that it's probably the most important driver of potential and current performance. So maybe people could be a little bit mindful of that. Maybe look at some of the research around that. That'll be point 1. I would say point 2 would be just be open-minded, whether you're a psych or a academic of any flavour or a practitioner. Try to see the other person's point of view. Maybe go and see what they do. So if you're a psych, go and watch some sessions on the grass. If you're a coach, go and see what psychs are doing in the classroom, or there's plenty of resources online on LinkedIn, YouTube, etc., that you can go and educate yourself. And look at developing the whole person, and rather than just what you see in front of you now, what is that person going to be like in 10 years, and how can you influence that to improve their journey and their life and their way of interacting with the world around them.
Brilliant. James, fantastic. Can't thank you enough for today. How can people find you, follow you, and get in contact?
Okay, so I'm on X as Coach Bazza. I'm on LinkedIn. A little search will find me. I don't think there's too many James Barracloughs. Or by all means, email me, J Barraclough. I'll spell that for you. JBARRACLOUGH1 @uclan.ac.uk. And also, I'm looking to deliver some CPD sessions if at academy level, if anyone's interested with that, alongside Tom Mitchell. So please feel free to get in touch if that's something of interest.
James, thank you so much.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me on.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook, or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.